What we need to talk about now is how we get negative, how we go below zero. And I think let's start with Danny. Make the case for why at all we are talking about carbon removal when we are still pumping out 40 billion tons a year.
I think that's the right place to start, and the right place to start in solving the problem is cutting those emissions. So I think we're all probably here on this stage in agreement on that point. But the reason we need to talk about removal is net zero is what's required to stabilize planetary temperatures. And when you look at the pathways to decarbonizing the economy, we know there's a couple of sectors that are going to be difficult, so there might be some residual emissions even when we make our best efforts. I like to start just by thinking about the agricultural sector. And we use a lot of nitrogen-based fertilizers. We put out nitrogen pollution that is part of a long-term warming scenario. And just interacting with that piece of the greenhouse gas emissions puzzle, you get to the need for gigaton scale carbon removal if you want to balance out just the residual nitrogen emissions from the from the agricultural sector. And you can imagine needing to do that in other sectors as well. So we know we need to get there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that, not everybody who's clued into climate change knows, which is that only about 75% of the climate problem is CO2, right? A quarter of the problem is all other gases. This is methane, this is nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide a little bit. And so even if we cut CO2 emissions, stop burning fossil fuels, we're going to have this residual greenhouse gas problem that will require us to go negative on the CO2, which sort of cools the planet, but allows us to get to a safer target. Maybe, if we get to net negative after 2070, we could actually get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this is a technology that we will need at scale decades later. But if we want it decades later, as we know with solar or with batteries, which were invented decades ago, we're going to have to start on that problem now. And Nan, at Stripe, you've been working on trying to make that happen, which is a little bit weird that a payments company is doing carbon removal, but maybe let's just start there. Why do you do it and how do you do it?
So our sort of hypothesis at Stripe has been that part of the reason that carbon removal has been so stuck in the mud is that there have been no customers to pay for that carbon removal. Unlike energy, there's no intrinsic value of most carbon removal if you're pulling it out of the sky or ocean and storing it somewhere you can never use it. And as a result, very few want to pay for it. I think the thing that makes it particularly challenging is that there are lower cost alternatives. And so new technologies that are going to be important in developing the portfolio of solutions we'll need in the future basically don't exist today. And the ones that do are super expensive. They're like the Tesla Roadsters of these technology, and they haven't gotten cheap yet. So our theory at Stripe, which started as a pretty small corporate commitment for $1 million back in 2019, was we're going to spend that $1 million, not looking for the maximum number of tons at the cheapest price, but instead trying to buy carbon removal from companies that we think have the potential to be low cost and high volume in the future, even if they're not there today, with the idea that, if you're an entrepreneur, why would you start a company if you're going to have no buyers? If you're an investor, why would you invest in a company that has no revenue? If we can give these companies more customers, then hopefully the sort of theory of change is that it unlocks a lot of other parts of the ecosystem. So we started with $1 million from Stripe. We turned that into a lot more by building a software product that makes it easy for Stripe's users to donate a fraction of their revenue to carbon removal, which we then pool together and use it to buy even more carbon removal. And then 2 weeks ago, we launched something called Frontier, which is an advanced market commitment for carbon removal. It's a $925 million commitment from Stripe, Google, Shopify, Meta, and Alphabet to basically do this over the next 9 years. And the point is essentially to send a big demand signal to all the entrepreneurs we need working on this, all the investors we need investing in this, that there is going to at least be the seed of a market, and it's compelling for them to spend their time on.
Now, that's the best segue to get to Peter to talk about all the wacky ideas around carbon removal. But before we get there, you could have just bought offsets for $2 a ton, or maybe 50 cents a ton if you search for it on the UN carbon neutral website. Danny, why can't we do that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons we maybe shouldn't. I guess some people are. One thing is that very few of these offsets deliver carbon removal. Most offsets are paying people to not pollute in the first place, which is something we need to do, and we can't get to net zero if everybody's trying to pay one another not to pollute and justifying their own pollution in that way. But I think maybe the broader reason is I think a lot of the voluntary offsets market is very low quality, and the claims that are being made by those credits don't actually deliver the carbon services that we want. And I think one of the key distinctions that Stripe and now with Frontier is making is instead of trying to find the cheapest, which often means the lowest quality, they're defining quality first, and they're saying, how can we deploy this fund most effectively? How can we bring into existence the companies and strategies that are delivering real carbon removal services rather than sort of paper claims that don't hold up when you dig into them?
So Peter's going to tell us about a wacky idea. Then I want each of you to tell me about your favorite wacky idea. I mean, you'll have to pick a favorite from your kids who you fund, Nan, so start.
Yeah, so I run a company called Charm Industrial, and we offer carbon removal in the form of bio-oil sequestration. So this is a new carbon dioxide removal method as of 2 years ago that my co-founder Sean cooked up. And the idea is that we take waste agricultural residue, things like corn stover or sugarcane bagasse or wheat straw, timber slash, all this waste cellulose that is already captured CO2, and we cook it into a liquid called bio-oil. It's not actually oil, it's actually mostly water and acetic acid and a bunch of other stuff. So we take that liquid that's super rich in carbon and we inject it deep underground, thousands of feet down into old oil reservoirs, old oil and gas formations. And so you have CO2 captured in the plants, turned into a liquid, and injected underground. And Stripe was actually our first customer. We probably would not have moved forward with this pathway that we sort of accidentally discovered if Stripe hadn't showed up like a week later and made the first purchase. So it was incredibly catalytic for us. The last 2 years since we invented this, we completed the first injection in January of 2021, a little over a year ago. And last year we sequestered about 5,400 tons of CO2 equivalent, which, while a very small number in the scheme of things, as far as we know, is about 90% of all the permanent carbon removals that were delivered last year. And so that should be shocking in its own right, that only 6,000 tons was delivered.
And that's what we can do in 2 years. So, 2070, not a problem, right?
Yeah. We only have to grow like a factor of 2 million in the next 28 years, which is like 65% year-over-year growth compounded. Twice as fast as software. Easy.
Easy. Your wacky idea, Nan.
Well, I'm particularly excited about ideas that are kind of at the intersection. I think there's sort of been this like false bifurcation between nature and tech solutions. And nature is great because it does the capture part for free and it self-replicates, which giant hardware does not. But the problem is it's not permanent, and typically not permanent, and it typically takes up a lot of arable land.
Just because he's sitting next to you, you don't need to pick his solution,
But there's a lot of really neat ideas in sort of looking for like really inert forms of biomass that essentially are kind of like the diamonds of biomass, and how can we create more of those so that we can harness the best of what nature has and sort of mitigate some of the downsides.
So I'll pick one of those, which is I recently wrote a story about pickling carbon. So there's a startup in Australia called Inter-Earth, which takes trees and coppices them, which is like cuts some of the branches, doesn't kill the tree, and they takes that biomass, and there are salty marshes or salty lands that have been created because of agricultural practices in large parts of Australia, and buries them underground in salt where they're essentially pickled, and at least the company claims so far do not escape back into the atmosphere through degradation, which would happen if you just left wood in the open air. So that's one. What's your favorite?
I'm going to sort of dodge because my organization, wants to try and stay neutral. I mean, part of our goal is to try and speak honestly about what we're seeing, and so I would fail at that mission if I picked a favorite right now. Other than to say, I think there's a lot of scientific complexity, and I'll give you an example of something that, just to contrast with what you just talked about. We sometimes hear people saying, "What if I just dug a hole and put some like trees in it, just to put some logs or some brush in it and just covered it up?" And that's not going to work, but it bears some similarities to the much more advanced things that people are thinking about. And I think part of the reason this field is difficult is because there's so much complexity in all the different approaches, and we need to be able to tell the difference between things that are silly, like digging a hole and putting some brush in it, covering it up and saying that's permanent, and thinking about modifying the chemistry or injecting things deep underground where we have a more plausible claim that we're keeping the CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Right.
Can I give two more?
Yeah.
Okay, so for color, one example is taking basalt and grinding it up and spreading it on fields. It's called enhanced weathering. And the basalt basically mineralizes in the surface CO2 into the rock, and you get permanent CO2 storage and potentially some soil benefits.
Yeah.
actually maybe challenging to measure, but if we can figure that part out, it could be quite cost effective. Another weird one, we have a problem with ocean acidification. Too much CO2 kind of going into the ocean and becoming too acidic. There's some interesting ideas now and companies forming around pumping acid out of the ocean. So pump hydrochloric acid out of the ocean. It actually makes more room for CO2 to go out of the atmosphere into the ocean, and you de-acidify it in the process, at least a little bit, which helps with marine life. So anyways, lots of interesting new solutions coming out around carbon dioxide removal. It's like a whole category of new companies emerging over the last 4 years beyond direct air capture that I think many of us have heard of before.
Yeah, a little more than a third or almost half of the CO2 we release actually goes into oceans. And you don't think about it because it's not in the atmosphere, but it is making a difference. Now, all of this, we talked a little bit about how to scale them. You started with $1 million just 2 years ago, and now it's almost $1 billion with this commitment. But billion-ton scale capture is a $1 trillion problem.
Per year.
Right? Per year.
In customers, not even in investment
in customers, and
CapEx.
actual money being given for some service, which is carbon removal. How much can private companies help at all? Like, is there an upper limit we are going to reach at 100 billion, and then it has to be all government? Has there been any modeling? Has there been any understanding? And maybe you start with Nan. And
yeah, here's what Danny thinks. But I mean, I think, yeah, at 10, call it like 6 billion tons of carbon removal per year by 2050 at, 10 or, $100 a ton. It's $600 billion.
That's for a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal.
Sure. So, but the point is that it's like $100 billion to $1 trillion per year. It's very difficult to imagine the voluntary market scaling by itself to that dollar figure. I mean, global GDP is like $100 trillion or something around there. So I think that we are going to need, there's basically no path to that without significant policy intervention. And I think that private companies can help make sure that by the time we have that policy intervention, we have solutions that we can even buy. And it essentially buys us time to figure out what we're doing on the policy side, but we're not going to get there without it. What do you think, Danny?
No, I think that's right. I think this is ultimately a public policy question, but what I find so interesting about it is that I think the government that's been moving fastest on this is the European Union, and I think Frontier is potentially out ahead of that in some respects. So I think the catalytic activity in the private sector has been really helpful to starting to figure out what works. Ultimately, the scale is going to require public policy to do this right. But it's not just, I think, philanthropy, because I think if you're a company that's trying to think about what a net zero world means, and your corporate strategy is premised on, I don't have to decarbonize because I can buy $2 offsets, you have a very different view of the world than if you figured out what it takes to get this job done right. And I think companies that prepare for that may have some strategic advantages in the way they think about those dynamics. But ultimately, it's public policy in the long run.
I think one more thing to add to that, Danny, is that and to your offsets answer, like if we were going to solve climate change with really cheap offsets, we would have done it by now. It is a supply problem. If we don't develop new supply now, we're just going to be myopically competing prices up on a very small pool of low quality supply today. And so the point of, when we think about policy, when we think about efforts like Frontier, it should be about pulling new supply into existence rather than just saying, companies that are trying to meet their net zero targets are not, that is not feasible. We're splitting up a pie that cannot be split in the ways that we need it to. So we can either confront that reality and do something to fix it, or we can pretend that we can, solve this with an accounting trick, which is just, we will ultimately pay the price for that if we sort of solve it that way.
Now I'm going to give a policy example from my home bills, but before I do that, send any questions to the app so that we can take those in the next 5 minutes or so. I looked at my water bill earlier this year and realized I pay, £20 a month in London. About £10 goes to getting the water to my home, and about £10 goes to actually treating the waste that I produce. And it's already something we do at a policy level. We know what to do if we really cared about treating a waste. We just don't treat carbon as a waste. Are there specific policies, Danny, that you see are in place today that could be replicated, like this water example or another, that, a specific intervention that is needed?
I mean, I think there are some analogies in the regulated utilities like water and electricity where we do see some waste and cleanup fees that are already in the structure. I think with climate, it's such a bigger issue and it's such a multi-sector issue. It's going to be new to do it at this scale. But again, to Nan's point, I mean, I completely agree. You can't sort of invoke government will solve this problem, so let's ignore it and just let government start from where it is today, which will fall apart. So, you know, I do think there's a lot of room for public policy. I think we're going to see public policy eventually start to think about procurement, which means that the efforts the private sector does to demonstrate those proofs of concept will be relevant. And ultimately, there's going to need to be public interest money that is buying some of this stuff at scale, because it's not just going to be corporate net zero targets that deliver the gigaton scale removal that we need mid-late century.
Yeah. And I mean, personally, as a journalist who writes about climate change, but also write about technology, which, you know, I find fascinating, I don't know of a parallel with another technology, not a software technology, where so many ideas have been proposed and so many companies have been started with such varying ways to try and trap carbon. So a recent example, Elon Musk had a $100 million prize. He has a $100 million prize for carbon removal, and they got 1,100 entries. I mean, I'm sure a lot of those are just, you know, kids wanting to meet Elon Musk, but that's still a large number. Now, Peter, tell us the story of how you got there, because, you know, 2 years to be able to do 90% of carbon removal sounds fantastic, but, you know, what gets you started? Like, how do you start thinking and, you know, build?
Yeah, I worry a little bit about policy discussions, actually, because, and I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but I think sometimes a policy discussion can get to a place where it's like, well, we throw up our hands and say, like, government will solve it. And like the last 20, 30 years has demonstrated that's not the case. And I think we have to, as private companies, as entrepreneurs, as folks in the nonprofit sector, have very high locus of control over what we can do today to get moving that will create options for policymakers. Because I think without options, policymakers actually can't move. And so I think what's so important about the work that Nan has done, what's so important about the work that Danny has done, and all the companies that are starting to build actual CDR in practice, is creating options for policymakers to actually put wood behind those arrows. And so I just want to make sure that when we think about policy, like policy I think is a lever for acceleration, but not creation per se.
Yeah.
And we all can contribute to that creation in very, very meaningful ways.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that we got started, I previously started and ran a software company called Segment, and about 6 years ago realized that we should offset our emissions. And I went through kind of a similar journey that I think many people have gone on, which is we purchased some Indonesian rainforest offsets, and about a year in, I was like, wait, what happened? And as I went down the rabbit hole of sort of inspecting like what actually happened in Indonesia as a result of us making this purchase, I just got incredibly disenchanted that like anything useful had happened from a climate or carbon perspective. I'm sure it was great for ecosystems. We should pay for that regardless. But from a carbon perspective, it wasn't there. And so in 2018, I went back to my sort of aerospace roots with a bunch of aerospace friends, and we started focusing on hardware for carbon removal as a pathway to really get started on the carbon part of the problem.
Now, Meg, do you have questions from the audience?
Sure. So we just listened to a debate before this, as you're aware, on whether or not we can reach net zero in your lifetime. What is the relative contribution CDR can make toward that goal?
Sorry, what is the
relative contribution CDR can make toward that goal?
I'll bite. I think CDR can do two things. First of all, you need a supply of CDR to balance out whatever your residual emissions are. So if you are limited on how much CDR you have, that's, you know, kind of there. And that's going to be a huge challenge. I mean, we've just been talking about scaling this. So we are going to have real trouble getting real scale involved, which is why we need to move quickly. If you're looking for percentage, I don't know. I think we can play silly games debating 5, 10, 15%. I don't think it's particularly helpful because I think the answer is as fast as you can possibly go. And I think what's most impactful about CDR is sending a signal for what the cost of cleaning up residual emissions should be. That's the realist benchmark. And I think from a strategic point of view, watching what CDR is doing and can do will help inform what we need to do everywhere else. And to me, that may be actually the biggest impact of the CDR discussion.
Right. That makes sense. Any more?
How do we know whether nature-based solutions are actually resulting in carbon removal, given weak data?
Maybe, Peter, you should take this because you went down the rabbit hole.
I think I went down the rabbit hole, but I'm by far the least qualified on this panel to speak to that.
I think
It's
Danny.
This is Danny.
It's so tough. I mean, I think, Akshat, you've done a really nice job just sort of pulling out all the different ecosystems and carbon cycle features that are affected. Carbon removal is this massive interaction with scientifically complex and often ecosystem-dependent issues. I can't answer that question. Are the trees going to be there for a long time? What's the long-term carbon cycle implications? What are the albedo effects? It takes literally a scientific analysis to do a very careful job of this. I haven't seen a lot of that care deployed in the private markets yet. That's not to say that we can't do this right, but it is a very difficult problem to talk about how to manage, for example, forest carbon, because you're talking about managing vastly complex ecosystems that interact with forest and timber product commodities market cycles, that interact with a changing climate, drought stresses, fire risks. And it's very hard to give a straight answer on that. And I worry that sometimes making overly optimistic assumptions has not helped us do right by forests or by the climate.
And I think in addition to that, even if we figure out all those problems for quote unquote nature-based solutions, we will run out of arable land long before we can hit this, gigaton scale that we need. So even despite that, we have to develop this other portfolio to sort of work alongside, trees and soil.
And there are problems with policy incentives. I mean, here in America, there are incentives for creating ethanol, which is helping cut emissions from fossil fuels, but it's happening at a time when there's food crisis happening elsewhere in the world and the corn is being used to make fuel. So there are these trade-offs that are very, very hard to predict or even project, right? Any more?
One last one. What is your opinion, anybody, on soil sequestration and regenerative agriculture?
Our opinion at Stripe, so we look for solutions that have more than 1,000 years of durability, of permanence, and we're open to many different technologies and approaches to achieve that. So far, we are not convinced that soil is going to get to that 1,000-year threshold. We have similar concerns with biochar, but are willing to be persuaded otherwise if there's compelling evidence.
I would just add that we actually produce a good amount of biochar in our process alongside the bio-oil. The bio-oil we inject, that's where we claim the carbon removal benefit. The biochar that we produce does go on the field, does help with soil quality, with water retention, with nutrition in terms of returning potassium to the soil, et cetera. We don't claim a carbon benefit from that because we're not confident in its permanence today.
Maybe just really briefly to add, I think permanence is got to be one of the key frames that people ask and answer these questions by. I think soil is one of the hardest to do right by a long-term permanence perspective. And similar to the way we talk about forest carbon, I think sometimes we're squeezing everything into a carbon bucket when it may not really be about carbon. So I honestly, my personal view is we should be thinking about carbon as a co-benefit when we think about how we manage lands and set agricultural practices. And that's a great thing if we get it, but oftentimes it's water quality impacts, it's other things we care about that can drive decisions in those sectors. I think it's been really challenging to tell a story about how you're going to lock CO2 up in a durable way. Think about trying to control land use in the future to keep the CO2 locked in those soils. It's a really tough problem to manage with contracts. And CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. It has a permanent emissions component that's essentially there forever. It's really hard to match these problems to the CO2 emissions scale. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing the things that produce carbon as a co-benefit.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question, and this is going back to the very first question, Danny, that you answered, which is make the case for carbon removal. Now, there is a scientific case which you made, and then we've discussed, how to try and achieve the scale. But there is a political question that's always asked, which is, fine, do that, but isn't that going to delay other people cutting emissions? What is the right frame to put the case for carbon removal while we cut emissions? Even as much as you say we should cut emissions, there is that risk, right? Maybe we end with you. Either of you?
Go for it.
I agree. There's that risk, which is why I think people who engage in this need to be proactive and need to talk about it. I also, on the other hand, I get a little sensitive to that because that kind of argument is used against making progress in any particular dimension. And there's so many things we have to do. Focusing on one of them and saying, oh, you're distracting from the others, it just doesn't work with climate logic. We need to do all of it. And And so I am really sensitive because I think when you're on the ground, when you're working in public policy systems, we're starting to see lobbying around enhanced oil recovery use the language and rhetoric of carbon removal. We're seeing carbon neutral fossil fuel shipments that haven't actually done CDR yet. And so I get that there are people who are invoking these framings, and that means that people who are trying to say there is a role for CDR need to be open and talking about that, because we need to be able to tell the difference between we have got to build something to get to the gigaton scale that the physical scientific needs tell us is going to be present in the coming decades, from using it as a tool for delay, which some people are doing and some people will do. But that's not all it is, and it's not all it should be.
Pragmatically, I would just add, in the field, as we go out trying to sell carbon removals to companies, the buyers are not the heavy industrials who are actually emitting. Like, heavy industrials don't have the margin to afford any of this stuff. And the people who are actually buying carbon removals are folks who have small footprints that can't be eliminated, like flying around salespeople. And there just are no electric aircraft yet.
It's also useful to just like parse the fact that carbon capture, when people typically talk about carbon capture, it's like flue gas capture on top of a cement or a steel plant. And what we're talking about now is carbon removal as defined by pulling CO2 out of the ambient air or ocean. And I think that there is just intrinsically slightly less of the moral hazard problem there, because it's not physically attached to a polluter. It is a sort of fully decoupled from that. I think that I agree with everything Danny said, but this field we've not yet come up with good terminology for all this stuff. And so I sometimes think carbon capture and carbon removal are not the same thing, and I think we need to sort of ultimately help folks understand the difference.
That's a good point to end a $1 billion initiative being put out around terms we still don't know, which is where we are with climate change. So thanks very much.